Okay, so we have done the introduction to the Constitution and we've done the preamble. So today we are going to do Article 1, which is Article 1 deals exclusively with the legislative branch. So as we get started here, we are going to first talk about. I hope I haven't gone too far yet. There we go. Congress. So there are two houses of Congress, and the first one, and Congress is what we call our legislative branch. This is the lawmaking body. There are two houses, and we have what we consider to be a lower house and an upper house. The lower house is the House of Representatives, HOR there. And the number of members per state is based on the population of that state. This was a part of the Connecticut Compromise, wherein the Senate gets two members from every state, and then according to the census, each state gets so many according to their population. And our current House of Representatives is capped at 435 members because of the Reapportionment Act of 1929. That's a big body. And so after every census, and even into the late 80s and 90s, we had as many as 7, and we are currently down to 5. And that's not necessarily just because we lost population. It's relative to the states, the rest of the other 49 states. So after the 2010 census, we stayed at 5, which is a good thing. We want as many as we can possibly get. The House of Representatives, they're elected by the people of that state, and they are elected actually by the people that live in that congressional district. They serve a 2-year term, and they can serve an unlimited number of terms according to the Constitution. There is no term limits for the House or for the Senate. Constitutional obligations are that they must be at least 25 years old, they have to have been a citizen for 7 years, and they have to reside in the state from which they are elected. And in an unofficial capacity, they really have to live in the congressional district from which they're elected. That's not a constitutional obligation. And they're also prohibited from serving in another federal office. So as long as they hold an elected seat in Congress, they can't hold another federal office. So the flip side to this is the upper house, which is the Senate. We consider this to be a little bit more prestigious body. It only has 100 members. Just think, I told you every state gets 2. We have 50 states. So there are 100 members. And this was part of that compromise that leveled the playing field for some of the lesser populated states. So it's a huge deal if you get elected to the state Senate or to the United States Senate from your home state. And we don't put them all up for election every 2 years. We have congressional elections every 2 years. So we have what we call a living body. Only 1/3 of the seats in the Senate are up for re-election during an election year. Congressional elections occur on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November of each even-numbered year. Hopefully you can remember that. But no, we want it to be a living or a continuous body, so that's why we divide it up like that. That only 1/3 of them are up for election every 2 years, and we can do that because it's a 6-year term. Senators were originally selected by the state legislatures, but since 1913 they've been elected by the people, and that was because of the passage or the ratification of the 17th Amendment. They serve a 6-year term. They can also serve an unlimited number of terms according to the Constitution. The constitutional obligations or requirements are a little bit higher in terms of standard. They have to be at least 30 years old. They have to have been a citizen for 9 years, and they must reside in the state from which they're elected. And the same rule that goes for the House and the Senate. Members of the Senate are prohibited from serving in another federal office. So what are their powers? And what we're really going to focus on here are their major powers. Okay, so the major powers are, one of the easy ways to think of this is that Congress controls the purse strings of our country. They really have control over the way we tax, the way we spend, and the way we create money, and the way that we borrow money. And that's huge. They can really, that's a huge power in terms of, when you think about three co-equal branches of government, that ability in and of itself is huge leverage against the executive branch, or it can be used as leverage. They also regulate international trade from our perspective, and they also regulate interstate trade within the United States. They are the ones that obviously maintain our armed forces. They have the power to declare war, and they have the power to make peace. A lot of people, now that presidential powers expanded in the last 80 years, and it allows presidents to put troops into combat situations, but we have not been in a declared war since World War II. Korea was not a declared war. Vietnam was not a declared war. The first Gulf War and the second Gulf War, neither one of those were declared wars. The president cannot declare war, but he can send troops into combat, and that's where a lot of people get confused. If you want a reminder of that, the great speech that FDR gave to a joint session of Congress on December 8th, 1941, he was asking for a declaration of war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And so that should kind of remind people, hopefully, that that's where the power to declare war actually lies. It doesn't lie with the president. But these are, those are the big three in terms of real power. One of the biggest and exclusive powers of Congress is impeachment. And we're familiar with this because we had an impeachment trial and an impeachment hearing this year. Or I guess, yes, in this last, over the winter. But they can impeach any official in the United States government. It's most commonly federal judges that are impeached. The United States has impeached 3 presidents in the history of our country. The first one was Andrew Johnson, who escaped narrowly in the Senate in terms of conviction. The second was Bill Clinton in the 1990s, and the most recent would be Donald Trump. We have never, though, impeached and removed a president from office. In other words, an impeachment is just a charge. It's like an indictment brought by a prosecution. The House of Representatives begins the process of impeachment by a majority vote. They hold all kinds of hearings. If you were paying attention this year, it's a long process. And then constitutionally, it used to be the vice president of the Senate, he's the president of the Senate. We'll get to that. Would preside over the judge or preside over the Senate trial. But now we have the Chief Justice comes from the Supreme Court, and he presides over the trial. The Senate sits as the jury. They conduct the trial and they act as the jury. The reason that we've never convicted anyone is because it takes a 2/3 majority to convict. If they're guilty, they were removed. And we've never done that. We've impeached 3 presidents, but we've actually convicted 0. The outside to that is beyond this. If the president escapes impeachment, that doesn't mean that they've escaped potential criminal punishment after their time as president is up. So a person can then be tried and punished in a criminal court, and that's largely going to be after they leave office. Non-major powers of Congress, they can establish the laws of naturalization. In other words, what does it take if you immigrate to the United States, the laws that revolve around immigration and the laws that revolve around citizenship itself. They fix the standards of weights and measurements, and I'm old enough to remember when I was in elementary school, there was a huge push to go to the metric system, and it really just kind of fell flat on its face. They can also make crimes concerning the counterfeiting of any United States government currency. They provide copyrights and patents to authors and inventors. Copyrights are pretty easy to attain. Patents are a whole different ballgame. They're very difficult to get, because there's so many different things that have to be proven in terms of the authenticity and that it is unique in certain aspects. They can establish post offices and create post roads back in the day. And then, among others of even lesser importance, they have what we call the elastic clause, or the necessary and proper clause. This gives Congress the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all the other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department of office thereof. What this basically means is that the Founding Fathers, when they drafted this document, they were allowing for some elasticity, to be able to create laws that fell under the guidelines of the Constitution for situations that had never come up. They were going, there's all kinds of, if you think about just society in general, since the late 1700s until 2020, society, in terms of what we accept and what we don't accept and what's a crime and what's not a crime, those things have changed dramatically over the years. And so that's really why the Founding Fathers put this in the Constitution. It was to allow federal law to grow as the country grew. And that's the Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 is the necessary and proper clause. So limits on congressional and state powers. Some of this we'll get into a little bit more than others. But a lot of these limits are not just for Congress, but they're also go to states as well. Congress and the states both cannot deny the rights of the criminally accused. And over the course of our history, and we'll get into a little bit more when we get into the Bill of Rights, when we talk about the first 10 amendments. But we have a pretty effective justice system. It's not perfect, but one of the big tenets of it is that the accused in this country are presumed to be innocent until they're proven guilty. And that's not necessarily the case in a lot of other countries, even what we would consider to be free countries. And we'll come back to that. But the regulation of trade, Congress cannot tax exports, things that are going out of the country. And they cannot grant preferential treatment to any state. In other words, they can't grant preferential treatment to California simply because they're so big and they generate so much, and they have such a huge economy. They're really not allowed to favor one state over any other. As far as states go, they also cannot tax exports, and they cannot break contracts. And in foreign relations, states have no foreign policy. Oh, and no armed forces. There was one more right there. Okay, so these are protections from the federal government and protections from the state governments. And there's three big things as far as the federal government goes. These are what rights of, if you've been accused of a crime, these are huge rights that you have. We don't allow for ex post facto laws. We're going to get into what those mean in just a second. We don't allow for bills of attainder, which this kind of goes back to our breakaway from England. And then no suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. We'll also talk about that. And the same basic protections that you get from the state governments over there on the right. No ex post facto laws, no bills of attainder. So what is an ex post facto law? Ex post facto is Latin for after the fact. And this would be a law applied to an act before its passage. In other words, you cannot be punished for something that was not illegal when you did it. So an ex post facto law would be a law that was created to bring punishment to somebody that had committed the crime before the law was passed. And this also goes to not just the type of law, but the type of punishment. They can't alter the punishment and make it worse and retroactively go back and give you more jail time or make the sentence any worse before that law was passed. So that's an ex post facto law. Bills of attainder are usually designed to come from a legislative body that inflicts punishment without any court trial. In other words, it's a declaration of guilt. And this is normally not done against an individual. Typically, when you saw these in England, it was they would declare a group of people guilty of some kind of crime. In our country, we have the right to a jury trial. In other words, the guilty verdict, and it can come from a judge, but we have the right to have a trial by jury, and the jury is your peers, the people that live around you. They're the ones that can declare your guilt. And then lastly is writ of habeas corpus. This is another Latin term which literally means to bring the body. You have protection from unjust arrest and imprisonment. And this was designed to protect people, especially political prisoners. And again, it's a reflection of some of the things that you would see happen in England. And so if you, even by today's standards, if you are jailed for something, if you may have your lawyer request a writ of habeas corpus through the judge. The judge is going to be the one that says, okay, well then I want to see this person. He's going to ask the warden or whoever's in charge of the lockup to bring this person into the courtroom, and the judge will examine what the evidence is against this person. Why are they holding him? I want to see what evidence there is. That's a writ of habeas corpus. And that ends our discussion for the day.